in healthcare, but I have a little less than that in chaplaincy. Like, I don't want to overstate my experience, but the majority of my experience is in chaplaincy to behavioral health patients. So I am currently the spiritual care manager for Dignity Health in the East Valley. I moved over there last year, and I am trying to infuse more behavioral health stuff for them. We did a suicide prevention campaign in September, and plan to do that hopefully every year. And so that, it really feels like I've been called over there to infuse some of this, but I also have 3 departments and 3 hospitals that I oversee, and trying to just grow spiritual care. It's so important. So let's go to my outline. And so we're going to go over a bit of mental health in general, in case, maybe you struggle with it, or maybe you have a loved one that struggles with it, and maybe we just need to go through some of the basics a little bit. And then we're going to talk about how mental illness can affect the person. And one of the things that highly affects someone's faith during a struggle with mental illness is their view of God, so we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about ways to maintain the connection to God. So gratitude, prayer, and meditation, the accepting of that you're not always going to feel near to God, treatments, memories, and maintaining hope, and how to do that. And then there'll be time for questions. So going on? All right, so the statistics show that 1 in 5, this is adults, by the way, 1 in 5 experience mental illness. That's a high statistic, 20% of adults. And then you have 1 in 20 living with a serious mental illness, which they here use schizophrenia or bipolar as examples of that. These numbers all come from NAMI.org, so that's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. If you are not a member, or if you need resources, you don't have to be a member. They have a lot of information out there. So they have articles and groups you can meet with and all sorts of stuff. So I highly recommend, if you need more information, this is a good source. 12 million adults have had serious thoughts of suicide. That 12 million, just think of that number. To me, that's at like almost epidemic proportions. And then we see that suicide rates have increased. The pandemic, of course, increased issues with mental illness. And so things like, we saw patients who had OCD come in, who it was exacerbated by, or people with substance abuse disorders that went back to them because they were isolated and couldn't get to their support groups, things like that. So that had a big impact as well. And then half of all mental health conditions begin by the age 14 and 75% by 24. So that's a good statistic to know, because you think about your life development, right? 14 years old, often that's a tumultuous time already. And then you discover you have some kind of mental illness. Sometimes, because it's a very tumultuous time for adolescents, it gets overlooked. We all have the stereotypical moody teenager, right? Who isolates anyway, who goes away. So sometimes they have it and it gets missed at that time for those reasons. So, all right, going on. So when we look at different mental illnesses, anxiety disorders are actually 19% of them are anxiety disorders. So that's the highest one. And anxiety disorder is not just, being nervous to get up here and talk, right? Anxiety disorder is something that regularly impacts your life. It's overwhelming anxiety and fear of different things. That would be an anxiety disorder. Bipolar disorder, it used to be called manic depressive. You have really high highs and low lows. People who are bipolar often feel really great in those manic phases. And sometimes they don't want to go on medication because they lose that euphoria, but it also often leads to impulsive behaviors that afterwards they're dealing with, whether it be spending a lot of money or, something like that. Making judgments about things or not making good judgments about things when they're in the manic phase. And then borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is very unstable moods, really impacts relationships, and it often is developed in people who've had a childhood trauma, some kind of trauma. And it's a difficult one to treat, actually. Depression, now feels like another common one, and it is fairly common. Depression is one of the biggest ones, I think, that affects people's relationship with God, is because you lose anything enjoyable. Nothing feels enjoyable. So that kind of connection you had with God no longer feels solid and no longer feels good. It's hard to find those good feelings. So going on. Obsessive compulsive disorder. So we all think of obsessive compulsive disorder as that person that's like putting the pencil in the right place or has to do something a certain amount of times. It can present like that, but there's more to it than just that. It's if I don't have the pencil in this place, something bad is going to happen. It's not just I like the pencil in that place and it bothers me that it's not there. That's not OCD. OCD can also present in loops of intrusive thoughts. And people will have these thoughts, and they're really terrible thoughts often, and they don't know why they have them, but they just can't get rid of it. I've met with patients who were fearful they might hurt their children, and it was an intrusive thought that just they couldn't get rid of. Or during COVID, there was one patient that I talked to, and he was so scared that he had given someone COVID. He told me the whole scenario of what had happened. And in my opinion, it was very highly unlikely that he had given someone COVID based on what he was telling me. And but he just couldn't get out of it. He kept going back to that. What if I killed someone? What if I gave it to some little old lady in the grocery store? What if she died? And eventually he goes, I have OCD. And I said, I kind of picked up on that at this point. And he goes, are you a counselor? And I said, no, but I've worked here for a while and I can pick up on some of these things. So that kind of looping where they just can't calm that thought, can't get rid of that thought, is also OCD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we always think of post-traumatic stress disorder as people in the military, but this is any traumatic event, whether it be an assault, whether it be a natural disaster that you've gone through, anything like that has impacted you greatly can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? And then schizophrenia, this is the one that most commonly has hallucinations, delusions going on. But others can also present with it. Bipolar disorder can present with hallucinations, delusions, those kinds of things. But this is the one most known to do this. And this is a break with reality. And some people who fall into these hallucinations, they cannot tell the difference between reality and their hallucination. It is real to them. It is real to them. And sometimes it's very hard for them to even realize that they're sick because it feels very real to them. Now, schizoaffective disorder is it's basically schizophrenia, but add in a mood disorder. So you have depression that also has these hallucination factors and things like that come into play. Going on to the next. So drugs and alcohol, right? This is one of those stigma areas that I think, we're making progress with mental health stigma. I really think we are. But I still see a lot of people that just look down upon people who are struggling with addiction because they think they have control over it. They may have had control over whether they started or not. But once it becomes an addiction, your brain chemistry is changed. Your physical body is now dependent on it. It's very difficult to change this. And therefore, relapse is very common, right? One of our units was a substance abuse unit and saw people coming in over and over again. But they were there trying still. That's the point. They're still trying, right? And then causes of it. We know there's a genetic component. We know that there are things that happen to someone that might cause them some pain, and they're trying to medicate that pain, whether it be emotional or sometimes physical pain. And then the developmental phase when someone starts. If you start young, the likelihood of quitting later is harder. The younger you start, the harder it is. And so this is why sometimes, too, you'll meet someone struggling with addiction that seems like they're younger than they are, immaturity-wise. They kind of, sometimes people get stuck in that developmental phase, or they don't move quite as fast once that substance abuse disorder has kind of taken over them. It is preventable, but it's preventable by not starting. That's it. So once it happens, it happens. And most of the people that I talk to with substance abuse disorders, they were struggling with some other kind of pain, sometimes another mental illness. And they never got the proper treatment for that. So what did they do? They tried to numb themselves with something else or calm whatever was going on with them. Maybe it's emotional pain that they don't know how to deal with, and so they turn to something to help them. So I think we need to have a lot more grace with people who are struggling with addiction, really. All right, going on. So psychosis is not a diagnosis of an illness, but it is a symptom of an illness, and that goes to these hallucinations, sometimes delusions, paranoia, those kinds of things, that anything that kind of has them break from reality is a psychosis. And then catatonia, you often, in movies and stuff, someone who's catatonic, they're just kind of sitting there in a zombie-like phase. That is one way it can present. The other way it presents is if you are doing a repetitive motion and in a trance-like state, like you're not responsive to anything. The first day that in my chaplain residency, when I was in the psychiatric hospital, there was a patient and she was just walking around herself in a circle. And she was considered to be in a catatonic state. She wasn't responding to anybody, but just doing that over and over and over again. Self-harm. I find people have difficulty understanding self-harm as well. It's pretty self-explanatory, hurting yourself, whether it be cutting, burning, pulling out hair. I've seen people rub until they're raw. Talking to people who do this, what they're trying to do, it's kind of the distraction of physical pain because of the emotional pain they're feeling. So not all of us would reach for that to distract us, but that is what I have talked to people about that do this. That's what they say is going on, distracting myself from the emotional pain I'm going through. And so going on. So suicide again. Let's talk about suicide again. I have a passion for mental health and helping people with mental health issues. And, we need to talk about not just mental health, but suicide, right? It's such a difficult subject to talk about for people. Nobody wants to go up to someone. Everyone's afraid to ask the question, right? Are you feeling suicidal? Are you planning to hurt yourself? And it's hard to say that. You don't ever want to think someone is there, that they're going to get to there. But the question needs to be asked if you think that is where they're going. Sometimes earlier on than later on. And so when we look at suicide too, we know that having mental illness is also a risk factor. So if you know someone who's struggling with mental illness and you see a lot of pattern changes, maybe they need some help. Suicidal thoughts in and of themselves are not an emergency. Many patients that I spoke to had plan B was always suicide. Always suicide. It was always in the background. Because if they couldn't find relief in some other way, that was an option for them. Everyone says it's not an option. When someone is struggling with something for so long and they don't see any other way out, it does feel like an option. It feels like a very real option. And here's the thing, some people say, I've heard people say it's cowardly, and how could they do that to someone else? They're hurting them. And this is the thing, they don't want to hurt someone. They want relief. They don't even truly want to hurt themselves, is what I found. They want relief, and they have not found any other way. They can't think of any other way to find it. And so that's where they come to. Going on? So the effects of mental illness. Here's the main one I'm here to talk about, right? Feeling distant from God. and why that might occur. That is true, especially, as I said, with depression, because you kind of are distancing yourself usually from everybody. You don't want to, nothing brings you joy anymore, and that includes your relationship with God. Difficulty praying, and this can be any multitude of reasons. You know, we talked about hallucinations, people hearing voices, gets in the way, right, of them connecting and praying. Also, maybe you don't feel like praying, you don't have enough energy. Anxiety comes in, and you can't calm down enough to kind of pray. And we're going to talk about some things to overcome that, or at least some tools that you could try to overcome that. We're all different, so some things might work for one person and not the other, and that's okay. And then finally, your brain is different with mental illness. They have done brain scans and noticed the parts of the brain that light up in different areas for different reasons. It is different. So we just need to remember that this is not just something the way you think. It's not just the way you think. It's also something within your brain that is causing these things. All right. So going on, so our view of God is very important, and I'm hoping everyone in here has a very loving, compassionate view of God. But the people, if you don't, maybe try to examine that and why that might be, because they've learned that people who are very rule-based about their religion and think that maybe God is wrathful and punitive, those are the ones that actually their religion, their faith, their beliefs make their mental illness worse, not better. And so if people can think of God as that loving being, and there's plenty in the Bible. God is love, right? So think about why and how you think about God in the ways you do, if you are struggling with that. And then, we have stigmatized in your faith communities. I know Jim enough to know that that's probably not the case in his church. But many people that came into the hospital would say things like, my mom just tells me I have to pray more, and my pastor says my faith isn't strong enough. And, they forget that this is an illness. This is an illness. Would you tell someone who had cancer, you're not praying enough? Praying enough will heal it. No, my bet is you would absolutely say prayer is a tool, but you probably wouldn't just tell them not to seek. You can get over this. You don't need to go to the doctor. You wouldn't do that. So we forget sometimes that this is not just the way someone thinks, something they can completely control. So the other part of it is, in that regard, is someone's depressed, and they don't know why they're depressed, because their life is wonderful, right? That happens. People have fantastic lives, and then they feel depressed, and they don't know why. And so they feel like, well, why am I not grateful? Am I not being grateful for what God has given me? Or maybe it's anxiety, and someone is very fearful, and they think, I'm not trusting God enough. Why can't I get rid of these anxious thoughts? Well, once again, we remember that it is an illness. So I talked enough about the last bullet. So going on. So let's talk about connections, gratitude. I used to give a gratitude spiritual care group. I would hold a spiritual care group about gratitude. And it's so interesting because they are studying gratitude. And we're not talking just about religious people studying gratitude. We're talking about psychologists studying gratitude and how it impacts our health and our well-being. And so the first bullet is from a study that they did where they had groups of people with depression come and write letters of thankfulness to people that impacted them in their lives. And they didn't even have to send them. I think some did, some didn't. But they focused on positive words and thanking people. And the effects on them increased over time. The good effects from this practice increased over time, which is unusual because usually you'll take a medication and then if you go off it, it goes down. And I don't know if it had to do with a change in thought patterns. That's very possible. But so let's talk about some ways to practice gratitude. So that was one way in this study. They wrote letters and thanked people. Another way is to have a gratitude journal. So I used to have a gratitude journal, and I had gotten out of the habit of doing it, and then I wrote this. And so I thought, I guess I should start that practice again, and I have. So I wrote 4 to 5 things in my gratitude journal before bedtime. And I try to focus on the things in that day, because you don't want to keep writing the same thing. I have a comfy bed. I have a comfy bed. I have a comfy bed. No. Find those little moments in time. Like one of mine was I was at work and walking past some bushes that had these beautiful purple flowers. And that was one of my gratitudes. Thank you, God, for the beautiful flowers. So sharing with your friends, when you share grateful thoughts with your friends, they actually say that helps bond you better too. You know how sometimes you have that friend that all you do is vent? You're like, work was terrible, and you go on about it. Well, that's not as helpful as saying, I had this wonderful day. So-and-so gave me a compliment, and this happened, that happened. So when you focus on those positives, it can actually build a bond, a stronger bond between you and your friend or your family member. So think about that practice maybe to incorporate as well. Mentally picture a place or a person that you feel gratitude for. This kind of goes hand in hand when I start to talk about memories, but picturing something, that feeling you had, that gratefulness you have for that person, that place, that thing that you enjoy. And then finally, saying thank you to one another and really understanding that what someone has done for you is a wonderful thing. Even the small things matter, saying hi to someone, giving someone a smile, all those little things add up in a day, and they can really make an impact. Going on to the next, prayer and meditation. All right, so regular prayer and meditation, this study is really interesting, has shown to thicken the brain's cortex. Interesting. And therefore sometimes protect against depression. So start doing it now. Now, you might already have a practice of that, and that is really good, but that is one thing they've learned. Now, if you're already struggling, if you're in a down spot, struggling with mental illness, trying to maintain that practice, some suggestions would be to pray something that you know, a prayer maybe over and over again, or you can have a meditative mantra, whether it be Holy Spirit come or, something about I trust God, and just repeating it. That way you're not sitting there when you're depressed or you're anxious and you're trying to stop your thoughts, thinking about what is it I should be praying about, right? Just go through that. Go through those. Maybe you have a favorite prayer. Maybe the Serenity Prayer, maybe the Our Father. Who knows? So pray even when you don't feel like it, right? So that's a hard one, right? You don't feel like it. How do you motivate yourself to do it? Well, try simple. Really try simple. And then using movement. We always have this idea that prayer has to be calm and sit and be quiet and those kinds of things. But you can use movement as well. Yoga can be a great meditative practice. You can pray during yoga. Tai Chi, I've never tried it, but I really wish I could because it looks meditative and good. And even walking can be meditative if you concentrate on what you're doing. And I have struggled with depression and anxiety. And at one point, I was at the height of anxiety. And I'm still working, I'm still going through it, but just feeling really anxious all the time. And what I used to do was I would go to my office. This is going to sound weird, I know, but I would shut off the lights and I would close my eyes and I would walk around my desk. And I did that because it forced me to slow down. If I walked too fast, I was running into something, I was stubbing my toe, whatever it was. So there's all sorts of, and I used to tell patients that. I'd say, try something like this. And because when our bodies slow down, often our thoughts slow down. And so that can be a helpful technique. And then going on, we have memories. All right. Mountaintop moments with God. When we have those, they're fantastic. We feel very close to God. And, some people have them, some people have not, and that's okay too. But if you've had one that you can remember when you're going through the tough times, then bringing that thought back into your mind. And then, remembering times maybe God came through for you, that you had prayed and something turned out just the way you had hoped, or maybe something turned out in a way that it had to be God. There was just everything lined up, and you're like, that's God. And then there's other people's stories. So maybe you can't remember one of those. Maybe you can't remember one of those for yourself, but you've heard your sister, your brother, your friend talk about something like that, or a miracle that they experienced or heard about. And so remembering those. Then your favorite worship song or praise song. Now, music has a great impact on our emotions. You can listen to sad songs and be crying. You can listen to an upbeat tempo song and be very energized. So what song makes you feel close to God? Maybe it's not a praise and worship song. Maybe it's some classical music you like, or I don't know, you pick. But what is it that makes you feel close to God? What song can evoke those feelings again, right? And remember who you believe God to be. Now, once again, this depends on your view of God. So remember, God is love. That's the important key point. God is love. And look at those passages that remind you that God is love. And grace for yourself, right? Mental illness is an illness. Grace. Give yourself grace that you're going through what you're going through. And it's important to know that, right? Once again, if you had a diabetes or a thyroid condition, you'd seek treatment. This is an illness. Seek treatment. Which gets us to the next one. Treatment. So, if you are struggling, seek treatment. Even if, you're not sure how deep it is or deep the issue is, but if you just feel like I'm going down or I'm so anxious that I can't drive, or whatever it might be, or I'm staying up 3 nights in a row and I feel great, but then I have a week where I'm depressed and I don't want to get out of bed. Think about your patterns and what's normal for you. And if you feel like something's not working, time to talk to someone. Don't resist medical treatment, okay? When I first started to struggle with depression, I was quite young, and I did resist medication. I went on it. They said, you should go on it. And I said, okay. And I stayed on it the minimum amount of time and didn't feel like it really did anything, but I didn't want to be on it because I was one of those people that thought, I can just think differently, and it'll improve. We'll just get better. And so I went off it. And then I continued to struggle and would have deep depression episodes, and eventually decided that maybe it would just be best if I maintained some medication to help me so I don't fall into that, the deep pit again. And so I'm doing very well right now and keep track of myself and notice triggers and things like that. But so know that new treatments arise often. People often lose hope when they keep trying different medications and they don't work, right? And I've talked to these people too. There's certain people that can be medication resistant, but every day they are studying and researching new things. Right now, one of the big ones is using psychedelics for treatment of mental illness. It's in the study phase, it's in the research phase, but it's that's where they're going with that one. Ketamine is a relatively new one. It was used for anesthesia and things like that, but it's now also used for depression. So when I talk to people that are like, nothing is working, I try to remind them that there are new things that come out all the time too. So, and don't fall into that pattern of God, that I'm weak, or that it's God's punishment to me, or I'm not appreciating God enough. Don't fall into that pattern. It's not true. It's just not true. All right. Going on. All right. So accepting the feeling of being distant. The dark night of the soul. You may or may not have heard that term before, but I loved the Oxford Language Dictionary about how it says no consolation. There's no feeling of consolation there. And so people who don't struggle with mental illness go through this too. So just know that you're not alone. Mother Teresa talked about her dark nights of the soul and how she felt distant from God, but she kept going. Don't expect the feeling to change right away. Hopefully with time, you'll return to those feelings of God's closeness. But don't expect it to happen immediately, and none of us can expect it to happen all the time as well. And then even if you're not feeling like it, or maybe you're angry with God, some people are like, why isn't God helping me? Why isn't God helping me with this? And, that's a fair statement. Lift all your concerns up to God. I mean, if we look through the Psalms, look at all the different emotions in the Psalms. You have sadness, you have anger, you have feeling distant from God in the Psalms. So don't think that you can't bring those things to God. All right, moving on again. All right. Accept help and hope from others. So this is the hardest one. If someone tells me they're hopeless, that's a hard one to deal with, right? How do you give someone hope that they don't have? You can't. You can't do it. Someone has to find it for themselves. But what you can do is have the hope for them. So I used to sometimes say, I know you don't feel like you have hope right now, but I do. I have hope for you. You're here. You're getting help. You're still trying. And so there's hope. I know you can't feel it right now, but I'm going to hold on to that hope for you because I do have it. And that was the truth. People would ask me, don't you get frustrated when you see people come back and things like that? No, I really didn't. Because as long as they're trying again, as long as they're getting help again, there's hope that it can get better, right? There's hope. Now, some people don't get completely better. Some people have hallucinations that do not go away completely, but they learn to live with, right? It's still better. Maybe it's not a cure, but it's still better. And so, we find that core group of people that we really can trust with everything. Not everyone is trustworthy, right? So find the people you do trust. I encourage folks to maintain their connections to their faith community, even if you don't feel like getting out of bed, right? And if it is not possible, if you are in such a state that you just can't do it, you can't get to your faith community, then at least find that core group of people that you can talk to. Don't isolate completely. The more you isolate, the less connections you have, the worse it will become. The more alone you will feel, especially if you're relying on God to be that hope for you and you don't feel that connection, right? Connection is key. And going back, I'm just going to step back a moment about connection. People with the suicidal thoughts, we'll talk about that again. One of the biggest helps for someone having suicidal thoughts is a sense of connection, right? So if you know someone that's struggling, and you can, I don't want to put a burden on anyone. You know what you can give to someone and what you can't. But if you can connect with someone and check in on them, this will be a great source of help for them to get past the suicidal thoughts. Okay? Going on? I'm ready for questions.